Hello everyone. Okay, so today what we're going to be talking is we're going to be talking about the value of the industry. And when we talk about the value, specifically we are talking about the money side of things. So how much money is the industry worth? What kind of economic impacts is it having? How many people does it employ? That's really what we are thinking about. Now, I believe in the last video I showed you, I had put this up on the PowerPoints. And essentially, why do we care? Why is this important? Well, I know a lot of people like to go into hospitality, tourism, and events because they like working with people. They, want to be welcoming and nice to people, but this is not a nonprofit, okay? So if you just want to be nice and help people, you should probably go into a different industry because hospitality, tourism, events, we are here to make money. Tourism is worth about 10% of all GDP globally. All right, and that's what you would expect when you're talking about 1.4 billion people traveling internationally every year. So roughly 1 out of 5 people travels internationally every year. They spend a lot of money, $1.7 trillion on tourism. Okay, so this is tourism receipts as well as transportation. Okay. Tourism and the industry as a whole supports about 320 million jobs. So that's about 10% of global employment. And these are numbers that increase every year. So typically we are seeing a growth both in terms of number of arrivals and in terms of receipts and the amount of money spent on tourism and travel. We're typically seeing between 3 to 5% increase every single year. And particularly with emerging destinations and new destinations, they're increasing at about twice that rate. So, and why do we care about the money and the people? Basically, it comes down to, tourism is bringing money into communities that may not have had that money otherwise. So you have increased incomes in these areas, which often leads to increased standard of living. Obviously, we've got new employment opportunities that we have to be thinking about. They're bringing in money in terms of taxes. There's lots of different economic improvements that are being made, particularly in terms of things like infrastructure and facilities. So tourism brings in money and taxes. That money is then used to pay for roads, to build schools, to build hospitals, and all of those sorts of things. So that's really why we care about the number of people and the amount of money that they're spending, all of those sorts of things. So in terms of what are the most popular tourist destinations, there are a number of them. About half of the people that are traveling are going to Europe. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Europe has a lot of teeny tiny little countries, and it makes it very easy for people to get around from place to place. If we're looking at it a little bit more specifically in terms of on a country level, here we see on the left, we see the top destinations. On the right, we see the top earners. Now, you will notice that just because it's a top destination does not mean that it is a top earner. For instance, here in France, we have, okay, this is the number one in terms of millions of people coming to France. Okay, so 89 million people go to France every year. 80 million people go to the U.S. every year. However, the U.S. is making, what is that, about 3 times the amount of money that France is making. Okay, so in the end, really what we want is we care more about the money than we do about the people. If we can make more money with fewer people, that's great. And you will see that some of these countries are not necessarily on both lists. So for instance, Mexico does have a lot of people and it's not one of the top 10 in terms of earners. Okay, so it's really important that we keep these things in mind in terms of amount of people that are coming, but then also the amount of money that is being spent in these areas. Now, we also have to be thinking about what we call outbound tourism. So inbound tourism is the people are coming in to a location. Outbound tourism is the number of people that are leaving a location, okay? Now, hands down, every year, more Chinese travel than anybody else in the world. Okay? And the Chinese spend a lot of money. So you can see that China spends more money than anybody else. Okay? They spend about more than 50% more than American travelers do. Okay? So ultimately, 1/5 of international tourism spending comes from China, then followed by the US. Okay? So it's really important to keep in mind again where money is leaving to go other places. Now, one thing that we do think about is the fact that 4 out of 5 people that are traveling internationally, they do travel within their own region, meaning that Australians travel within Asia Pacific, English, they travel mostly within Europe. So a lot of times people are staying within their own continent or within their own region. So we do certainly consider that as well. Okay, so next things next. Essentially what we're looking at is we're looking at tourism as being very important economically. Okay, so tourism is the largest service-based industry. So that means we are not producing products, we are producing services. In developing countries, service accounts for typically less than 50% of GDP. So in countries that are developing, at least half or more of their GDP comes from the production of products. In developed countries, it is a little bit different, okay? So in developed countries, you're looking at over 60% of GDP comes from the service sector. And that really has to do with the fact that as a country becomes more developed and more established, as they have more wealth, they move further and further away from what we call blue-collar jobs, which is typically production, and into what we call white-collar jobs, which is, your services. However, it is really important to note that the positive impact of tourism is often overstated, okay? So normally when you're looking at a destination that is considering implementing tourism and really increasing their tourism infrastructure, a lot of times they think and they talk about the fact that they're going to make so much money from tourism, and that is not always the case, okay? So really, really important that we need to keep that in mind. Okay, so economic impact, as I was saying, positive impact of tourism often overstated. It is very important to note the fact that economic impact is not the same as tourism receipts. And when we are actually assessing the economic impact of tourism, or any industry for that matter, there are a few things that we need to take into account. Leakage, direct, indirect, and induced effects, as well as displacement and opportunity costs. And just hold tight, I will get to those very shortly. Now, in terms of arrivals and receipts, just comparing this on a worldwide level, as you can see, typically each year, number of people grows, and each year, more or less, the amount of money grows. Now, we are in an interesting situation at present because we are in the midst and hopefully towards the tail end of the coronavirus issues. So these numbers will drop very dramatically in 2020, potentially also way into 2021, 2022. We'll have to see what happens. But for the last, I don't even know how many years, I can certainly say with confidence the last 4 decades, we've only seen an upward trajectory in terms of international tourism. But that is going to change. One thing that could be quite interesting is, so international travel, international tourism is really important. However, a large proportion of spending is actually from domestic tourism. So we really do have to keep in mind the fact that the domestic tourism that is happening is often even more than the international. So as you can see right here, okay, we've got 28, almost 29% of travel spending, tourism and travel spending is internationally. 71% of that is actually domestically. So particularly when we start talking about responding and bouncing back from COVID-19, Australia has already talked about how they really want Australians to stay here and spend their money and not travel overseas. That, of course, is being highlighted by the fact that we're not actually allowed to leave and go overseas. But domestic tourism is probably going to be even more important over the next several years as a result of this. Now, there is one thing that we do like to talk about, and that's what we call tourism balance sheets. So there are some countries that have what we call positive tourism balance sheets. There are other countries that have what we call negative tourism balance sheets. So here what we have is we have the, this is the amount of money that countries are making. This is the amount of money that countries are spending. Okay. Now, as you can see here, China is by far spending a lot of money. However, they are not making a lot of money. That means they have what we call a negative tourism balance sheet. Okay. The U.S. is making over $210 billion from tourism, but Americans are only spending $135 billion in tourism when they go overseas. So that means the U.S. is making more money from tourism than it is losing from people spending their money outside of the U.S. So the U.S. has what we call a positive tourism balance sheet. So one way to kind of keep this in mind and remember this concept and keep, the spenders and the recipients of that money in check, it might help you to actually figure out and look at this and see, okay, who's positive and who's negative based on this and why. So that may just help you with remembering some of these concepts. Okay, so some of the ways that we actually measure economic impact, one is visitor arrivals. So how many people are coming, where are they coming from, what are they doing? So are they here for business or for leisure? Currency exchange information is very important. So when the Aussie dollar goes up, that means that Aussies can spend more. They're more likely to go overseas. When the Aussie dollar goes down, we tend to have a lot of people come from overseas because they can get more for their dollar here, and Australians tend to stay home and travel domestically. So we're always looking at what does currency exchange look like, as well as tourism expenditure. So we will sometimes, you may see this at the airports when you're leaving Australia, they might have somebody come up and survey you and ask you, what did you do? What did you spend your money on? To get an idea as to how much people actually spent while they were here. Now, we always look at, when we're talking about economics and economic impacts, we do talk about the benefits and the negatives. I already mentioned some of those benefits, but there are a few negatives we do have to think about as well. As I was saying before, a lot of times tourism is overstated. Sometimes countries or destinations become over-dependent on tourism. That's very scary, particularly when we have a tsunami or a hurricane and, somewhere cannot, reopen right away. So over-dependency on tourism, really problematic for some destinations. Okay, so one thing that we were talking about before is what we call leakage, okay? So not every dollar that a tourist spends in a destination is actually used in that destination. So if a tourist spends $100 in a resort, that's what we call a direct impact. So they're paying for that hotel room. However, that resort may use 50 of those dollars to purchase food from a local farmer. So that's what we call an indirect impact. However, maybe 50 of those dollars is paid to expat workers who then take that money overseas. Maybe the company is from abroad, so that money, again, does not stay in Australia, it goes somewhere else. So the direct impact of that $100, stays right there in the hotel, but actually only $50 of it is used again in the indirect impact. So now we have that $50 that's staying within Australia. Maybe 20 of it is, again, used by the farmer to purchase labor. So this is what we call our induced impact. But then again, some of it may be lost a little bit later. So these are always things that we are thinking about. There's one other concept that I want you to be familiar with, and that's what we call tourism satellite accounts. When you get into your economics class, you'll understand this a little bit better, so I'm not going to go into detail with this, but there is a reading for you on TSAs, so you should at least be familiar with the term tourism satellite account, because inevitably in the future you will be learning more about this in some of your future classes and when you're out working in the industry.